Sacramento State University. We're so glad that folks can join us for the Doctorate in Educational Leadership Speaker Series. This is our second Speaker of the Year, and we're very excited to have Assemblymember Roger Dickinson with us. Dr. Ted Lasher will introduce him in just a moment. And again, what a great crowd. We were so worried that Friday traffic, happy hour would keep folks from coming to this event. And it's a very important issue. School discipline, the disparate impact of discipline, especially on communities of color, is a very important issue in this state. And the legislature, we can say, in this state has acted on this issue. And we're so happy that we live in a state where the legislature, working with educators and communities, are cognizant of the challenges facing our black boys, our brown boys, and other communities rural communities across the state. So without further ado, I will bring up Dr. Lasher to introduce our speaker. And then at the end, I will moderate a panel with an esteemed superintendent from Natomas and also a elected school board member from Natomas. So don't leave after Assemblymember Dickinson is finished. We will have a panel afterwards.
Thanks, Julian. So my name is Ted Lasher, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Public Policy and Administration, and I'm also on the faculty of the Educational Doctorate program. And it is really a pleasure for me to introduce Roger Dickinson, who has a truly distinguished record of public service and as an attorney. He's currently an attorney with Greenberg Torrig in Sacramento, where he focuses his practice on a wide range of matters such as government law and policy, environmental issues, and public infrastructure. He is also currently the practitioner in residence in the College of Social Sciences and Interdisciplinary Studies, and in fact, he's the first person to hold this position. Prior to his current work, he represented California's 7th Assembly District in the state legislature, including the cities of Sacramento and West Sacramento. As an assembly member, he was a strong advocate for a number of causes, such as for youth, the environment, and job creation. Before that, he served almost 17 years as a member of the Sacramento County Board of Supervisors. He earned his bachelor's degree from the University of California and his the University of Southern California, right?
No, please no.
UCLA, right?
Law degree.
Yeah. Almost made a terrible mistake. So he has a bachelor's and a JD. For our purposes today, what is especially notable is that he's really been a leader he was a leader in the legislature and really nationally among policymakers in terms of issues relating to reform of policy in the area of the very important area of expulsions and suspensions. So he authored a bill on this topic, a major bill that was signed into law, AB 420, that eliminated the ability of schools to expel a student for so-called willful discipline, and I'm sure he'll say more about what's entailed with that, and probably a lot of you are already very familiar with that, and eliminated expulsion and suspension as a disciplinary measure in grades K through 3. So it's really a pleasure to have Roger Dickinson here. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that very nice introduction, and let me add how I'm impressed that you all are here at 5:30, because normally I wouldn't be here at 5:30 on Friday. So I'm delighted to have the chance to talk a little bit about a subject that I care very much about. But just so you can remember about educational background, I'm wearing blue and gold. That's not an accident, but I do have my Sac State campaign. So I thought where I'd start this evening is with a little bit of background, because one of the questions I got most often, I'd say, through the course of taking up school discipline as an issue was what made me interested in it in the first place. What grabbed my attention about it? And as Ted mentioned, I spent almost 17 years on the Sacramento County Board of Supervisors, and during that time, I was actually quite involved with the school districts that overlapped, at least in part, my supervisorial district. I also was very concerned about health and welfare, especially for children. I chaired Sacramento County's first 5 commission for the first 10 years of its existence, for example. And that coupled with my background, which has always been founded on the notion that education is the fundamental element that creates a society which is both a viable democracy and a vibrant economy. Now, some of that may be attributable to the fact that my father was a professor at the University of California at Berkeley. My brother was a professor at UC Davis and at Chico State for many years. And my wife is an assistant vice chancellor at UC Davis. So we have a little bit of higher education in the bloodlines and the marriage lines, as you can tell. But it was that notion, that precept, that education lays the foundation for everything else, that made me always concerned about the quality and the character of education. What I realized early on, and why I became involved as a county supervisor, I became involved in the educational aspects in the school districts that were part of my supervisorial district, was that I realized, and really this, something of an epiphany about this came to me from a former school board member in Rio Linda, Alberta, in the Rio Linda School District, I should say, many years ago, was that there really was no difference between the kids that the county was concerned about through our health and welfare departments, through our public assistance department, through our probation department, or even the sheriff's department, and even our Department of Transportation. There really was no difference between those kids and the kids that were showing up in the classrooms of the school districts that were part of the county. And that if the kids who were in those classrooms had a difficult time getting there because there weren't sidewalks between where they lived and the school they were going to, that became an issue for the county, and that was an issue for the school. If those kids weren't doing well in school, if they had mental health issues that made it difficult for them to participate or succeed in school, those were issues for our county mental health department as well. And everywhere I looked, the lines crossed. It made clear sense to me as time went on that when kids weren't doing well in school and didn't succeed ultimately in their education, that not only was it expensive in every respect, not just monetarily, not only was it expensive for them as children, it was expensive for the rest of us as taxpayers and participants in our communities, and people who ultimately were denied the benefits of the potential of those children. So I became involved in those issues that cut across those lines, and along the way became very involved in issues having to do with youth violence and gang violence in about the 2007-2008 time frame in particular, and worked at some measures at the local level. But at the end of 2010, I went off to the legislature and felt that these were still issues that were so important to me personally that I didn't want to leave them behind, notwithstanding the change of form. So I asked the Speaker of the Assembly to allow me to chair a select committee on delinquency prevention and youth development, which he graciously assented to. And so that select committee was created in 2011. We began to hold hearings with the committee around the state. In December of 2011, we held a hearing in San Francisco and focused on student discipline. It was not, to tell you the truth, an issue which I really had ever previously paid a whole lot of attention to. I had been focused on other aspects of issues related to young people. But the issue of student discipline had not really emerged. At least it hadn't for me at that point. But the hearing we held in San Francisco was like a light bulb going on. It was listening principally to students, to teachers, to administrators, to probation officials, largely from the Oakland Unified School District, although we had some other witnesses from around the Bay Area. And what they told us was so profound in the reality of what it meant for kids trying to go to school and stay in school, that it was a subject that at the conclusion of the hearing I said can't be left unattended, at least not as far as I'm concerned, if I can do something about it. Because what they talked about in their own experience was what had happened to kids who had been suspended or expelled, and how disparate the treatment was of some kids versus other kids, of the differences in the way discipline was handled from one school to another school, and the difficulty of catching up when you miss school. All those kinds of issues that I know many of you in this room are familiar with. So as I began to dig into this issue, the larger facts beyond the anecdotal stories were frankly even more disturbing. When I found that here in the state of California at that time, that we were suspending more students out of school in the course of the year than were graduating, that stopped me. When I saw that we were in a position where if you were an African American male, you were 4 times more likely to be suspended out of school than your Anglo counterpart, that stopped me. When I saw if you were an LGBT identifying kid, you were twice as likely to be suspended out of school as your non-LGBT identifying counterpart. If you were disabled, you were twice as likely to be suspended out of school at some point as those who didn't have a disability. If you were Latino, the ratio wasn't quite as bad. It was more on the numbers of 1.5 to a little less than 2 to 1, still disparate. But as many of you may know, our single largest numeric number of people in our schools are Latino now in California. So while the disparate nature of the ratio wasn't quite as great, the numbers were huge in absolute terms of Latino kids. But it wasn't just that kids were getting suspended out of school, and by the way, the bulk of them at that point, nearly 50%, for something called willful defiance. Now, Chris can tell me the right number, or Sue, I'm sure, there's something like 24 reasons in the California Education Code. Is that right, 24?
I don't have all of them memorized.
There's something,
Ballpark is good
there's
enough.
about,
Yeah.
check me on this, but 24, 25, 26 reasons, and all the things you would imagine. Bringing a gun to school, getting in a fight, the kinds of things that we would all agree constitute serious activity that would justify removing a student from the classroom and from the school. But the catch-all category is one called willful defiance. And willful defiance is literally anything. It can be anything. I'll tell you about a story just to try to illustrate the point about how it be anything, of a 5-year-old in Stockton. The 5-year-old bit a policeman, and he was suspended out of school. He said, well, I don't care what age you are, you can't go around biting a policeman. But what had really happened? What had happened was that the 5-year-old was acting up, and so the school felt they couldn't get control of him. They called the cops to come. And the cops came, and the 5-year-old ended up, while the cop was trying to get control of him, biting the cop. Well, after they took a little time and began looking into the kid's background, turned out he was developmentally delayed. But the resolution that they thought would work was suspending him out of school. Now, another similar kind of case actually comes out of not California, but Colorado, and I think also illustrates how willful defiance, and this is not just a California issue, it's a national issue. It's been the subject of commentary from the U.S. Attorney General and the U.S. Secretary of Education. That gives you an idea of the national dimensions of this. A 6-year-old in Colorado, little boy, was standing in line next to a like-aged little girl and began singing a song he'd heard. And part of the lyrics of the song were, "I'm sexy and I know it." The response of the school was to suspend that kid for sexual harassment. So let's take a poll. If you think that little 6-year-old boy had any clue what he was singing in substance when he used those lyrics, raise your hand. I don't see a lot of hands. My hand's coming down. Let me tell you. It is that kind of approach which has gotten attention all across the country and made people start to rethink how, where, when, and why we administered discipline, and especially this category of willful defiance. If you talk to some in education, they will tell you that in places there are teachers who will put those who they expect will be behavior problems by the door, so they're close when they send them out of the classroom. It's hard to believe, isn't it? But I've had it said to me by too many people to think that it has never happened. There are those who think that if you behave by saying a not so nice word or not doing your homework, that you ought to be suspended out of school. In some schools we found in California that were particularly heavily African American, as many as 80% of the boys over the course of their high school years had been suspended out of school. So these were the kinds of both anecdotes and facts which I think became the compelling substance of suggesting that we needed to do something to address this issue at the state level, and hence the legislation that I first introduced in 2012, and which made its way to the governor on this subject and was actually vetoed by the governor on the basis that this was an issue of subsidiarity. For those of you who follow Governor Brown, he likes that term. Employs it when it's to his purpose to do so, which means not all the time, but ought to be left to teachers and administrators at the local level, because they are the people in the classroom, in the school, and know what's happened and know the circumstances. And generally, I think that's a very defensible point of view. But when you see a pattern or a practice of activity at a state level that in many respects shocks the conscience, then I think it's time for the legislature to act. And so, notwithstanding his veto and being a little hard-headed about these things, as I am, I wasn't about to give up and came back with AB 420 in 2013. And it took us 2 years to not so much to get through the legislative process, that part actually was not that difficult, but to actually work out an agreement with the governor that persuaded him to sign what became what we now live with under AB 420. And it's a much more limited approach than I started with, and it sunsets in July of 2018, which was something he required because he wanted to make sure he was still in office when it came back around. It's limited for suspensions for willful defiance to grades 1 through 3. You can't use willful defiance to suspend a kid in grades 1 through 3, or K through 3 really, for willful defiance. And you can't expel a kid in any grade simply for willful defiance. But what's really important about this is not so much the legislation, and I say that despite the fact that, I'll be quite honest with you, I have a great deal of pride in this legislation and in going through this this process and down this road. What's really been important, it seems to me, is the way in which people in education have responded. And I think that not only, as I realized, more and more people in education began to realize that what we were doing was making a big mistake, because research tells us that a child who's suspended out of school even one time is twice as likely to drop out. And that kids who are suspended out of school are 5 to 11 times more likely to become involved in the criminal justice or the juvenile justice system. By and large, in a historical sense, a lot of people in education, I think, without thinking about it this way, or certainly not articulating this way, thought, I've got a problem in my classroom. The way I solve that problem is to remove what I consider to be the problem. Now, whether it becomes someone else's problem or not is not my concern. But the thinking, I believe, has really changed quite substantially. And I think Sue and Chris will probably both reflect the change in thinking that has occurred all across the state. And it's also reflected by the fact that the number of suspensions are coming down, and the number of suspensions for willful defiance are coming down. The number of schools and school districts that are instituting practices like PBIS to support positive behavior interventions and supports is what PBIS stands for, as you probably know. The number of districts and schools that are using those methods has increased dramatically. The number of schools that have instituted restorative justice programs has increased dramatically. And I really believe that we have turned a major corner in how we look at student discipline. I got to give you one other little just demonstration of what thinking used to be and why it changed. There was a school district here in the Sacramento region, not Natomas, that we were having a discussion one day about truancy, which is not unconnected from discipline. But this district had a policy that if you were truant as a child, they would give you detention. And if you were truant a second time, they would give you a longer detention. And if you were truant a third time, they would suspend you out of school. Doesn't quite make sense, does it? I think we want kids in school, not out of school. Well, that policy has changed in that district, and I think again that's a reflection of the increasing recognition by educators that we need to keep kids in school, because if they're not in school, they're not learning. If they're not learning, they're not getting prepared to go out into the world. And if they're not prepared to go out into the world, we're right back where I started as a county supervisor. Then those kids are being taken care of by the probation department, or the public assistance department, or the mental health department, or the sheriff's department, or the police department. And so I'm very delighted, I have to say, at what I think by and large has been the response to this issue being raised. Now, is it easy for teachers and for administrators in schools to take a different approach to this issue? No, I do not think it's easy. The question often came up, no, wait a minute, are you telling me I have to keep a kid who's disrupting my class in my class and take valuable time at the expense of the other 30 kids in my class who want to learn? Is that what you're telling me? And I said, no, that's not what we're telling you. We're telling you that discipline is necessary and appropriate under particular conditions. This is not about getting out of jail free for kids. This is about making sure that the discipline that we use is, one, appropriate to the circumstances and proportional, and two, effective. That's the issue. So it means looking at what you do in your school and the way you address discipline, how you treat those kids, and how you administer discipline in order to keep them in the school and on the right track. So let me illustrate that with another story. We had a hearing at which the principal from one of the high schools in Woodland testified. And she related how she had been on cafeteria duty one day when one of the girls walked by her with her lunch tray, and the principal said, "Be sure to bust your tray." Instead of doing that, the girl turned around, looked at the principal, took the tray, and turned it upside down and threw it on the floor in front of the principal. Well, the principal, of course, said, that was a pretty clear demonstration of willful defiance. I mean, there really wasn't a lot of ambiguity about that. I could have suspended that girl on the spot, and nobody would have said I was out of line as the principal in doing that. But she said, after my first inclination to do that, I caught myself. And I said, let's go down to my office and sit down for a minute. So they did that. Well, when they sat down and started to talk, the principal learned that the mother of that girl had abandoned the family that week, that there were a host of other issues in that girl's family, and she was literally acting out. As they talked it through, the girl realized that what she had done wasn't the appropriate thing to do, certainly under any circumstances. They got that girl some help, and she became one of the very best students in the school. Now, think what would have happened if the principal had followed her first instinct. I think you would have had a very different outcome in all probability. One of the more fascinating transformations came about at Garfield High School in East Los Angeles. Garfield High School was suspending 650 students a year. 650 students a year. A new principal came into the school and said, "This that makes no sense." As a matter of fact, it was a very interesting story because the principal had grown up in the neighborhood of Garfield, but had not attended Garfield as a student growing up. But he came back as the principal. He said, "We're going to change the policy and the practice we have here, and over the span of 2 years, their suspensions went from 650 a year to 2. From 650 to 2. Now, you would expect that you stop suspending kids, your attendance is going to go up. You're keeping kids in school, and yeah, that did happen. Their attendance went up by about 5%. But more surprisingly, in a way, and more importantly, the school's API went up by over 100 points. A pretty clear demonstration that when you change your approach and your practice and your policies, you not only keep kids in school, but you can actually improve educational outcomes as well. Now, I don't think that what happened at Garfield High School, that turnaround, that dramatic shift, was simply a function of suspending fewer kids out of school. It doesn't happen that way. It's about changing the environment and the atmosphere and the culture of the school. When we communicate to kids that we believe in them, we want them to succeed, we want them to learn, that we will support them, that we have high expectations for them, most kids are going to respond to that. And they're also going to respond in a different way if the message we communicate to them is, you've got to be here, you better pay attention, you're going to get penalized if you don't do this or that. Kids aren't stupid. And I have to say that one of the things I often talked about was, kids get it. I mean, if our schools are falling down, if they don't have air conditioning and the lighting isn't good and the facilities are crummy and the mall is shiny and bright and everything is new and flashy, do you think they don't understand where our priorities are? Of course they do. So, as I get off my little soapbox, all I want to say in conclusion is that when we change the way we approach kids, and what we do in discipline is part of that, that we create a whole different culture and atmosphere that reinforces learning and reinforces growth and reinforces commitment to education. And that I am very, very pleased and proud of all the people, professional educators in California, who have responded to this issue. For some of them, it's been really tough. I know it's really been hard to make a change. It is for all of us. But I think we are on the right track. I think we are making great progress, and I'm so proud of people in education who have a commitment to this kind of change. Thanks very much.
So now we're going to move to the panel portion. I'd like to invite Superintendent Chris Evans from the Natomas School District to come forward. And also our own Dr. Susan Heredia, who is an elected school board in Natomas and a former teacher. So to get us kicked off, one of the words that we talked about beforehand was restorative justice. We're also talking about beforehand that the Civil Rights Project at UCLA released a report in December showing that suspensions were down by 200,000 in 2014 between 2011 and 2014. And so we've been engaged in these conversations about accountability and testing and accountability formulas and APIs for quite a long time in California. But now it seems like there's some attention being paid to this issue. Do you think that's the case? Do you think that is to be credited for that big drop? What do you think?
Absolutely. Julian, right to tie with your data. We have data. I have some data here from 2011-12 in Natomas Unified, all the way up through last year. So our enrollment increased about 10% to 13,630 students by the end of 14-15. We actually served 14,700 in that year. Our suspensions from 11-12 to 14-15 for defiance, 48,900K, that Roger spoke a lot about, decreased 81% over that same period of time. Expulsions during that same period decreased 58%. Suspensions decreased 13%, and our suspension rate decreased by 12%. So I absolutely think this is a time throughout the state where we're having these conversations and taking a look at behavior and how we can support our students and meet their needs, as opposed to just use discipline as the first step.
So, I'm a Lossinger, recovering from strep throat. So one of the things I think was really important, Roger talked about the change in restorative justice. There's a lot of teachers that go through training in restorative justice. I was fortunate enough to see one of the students from Sac State who got a credential, and it was actually facilitating the discussion in the class. It was really great to see one of our former grads doing this. And he was my student. But I think there's another thing that that we really have to pay attention to, and that's the idea that you can put a lot of policies in place in schools, but you also need to have that professional development for teachers in order to execute those policies. And I think that's the real critical point of view. And so not only the professional development, but it's a whole way of looking at kids. Because, as you know, many of the teachers in our school districts teach kids who are very much unlike themselves. Who they didn't grow up with these kids. They grew up with a different kind of set of kids. And even when you look at the demographics of who the teachers are, when 75% of the teachers in the nation, or even in California, are white middle-class females, and then you look at the student population. So that in and of itself speaks to the need about truly understanding what's the foundation that has to be built in order to support the legislation that is carried by our legislators.
That's a big issue. I mean, it's not just California, it's Texas. 80% of Latino males and African American males are suspended out of high school in the state of Texas. 80%, right? And research by one of my former students at the University of Texas showed for the same disciplinary offenses, they were more likely to be suspended because there's some discretion that goes. One of the things the legislature also did was they provided some big money for professional development. I was wondering if maybe you could talk about, has that money been rolled into these conversations about school discipline in districts across the state? Should they be? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the money that's been made available is one-time money that was provided to us from the state for any kind of professional development for certificated employees, teachers and managers, and absolutely. It should be used for instructional training and development. It should be used for social justice programs. In Natomas, we have a restorative justice pilot that we have at Natomas Middle School, one of our middle schools. And likely they're going to expand it to our second school next year. And that's a perfect use of that resources to help train teachers and administrators. And frankly, I think we need to find other resources to help train classified employees as well. Because the idea behind restorative justice is that when there's an incident or someone feels wronged, that people get together and have conversations and work through that, as opposed to using discipline as the first initial action. And that's going to involve everyone at a school setting. We also have a parent university that we've launched, and that's something we need to look into, and how do we engage parents in the idea of restorative justice and practices, because that can help strengthen relationships with staff as well as parent-students.
Well, I just want to come back to the professional development component for a second, because I think it's really important. I came over here in 2011 and talked to some of the faculty in the credentialing program, and I asked them what is in the curriculum of the credentialing program to teach classroom management. How do you do that? And I said, well, we put people out as student teachers. I said, do you give them any instruction at all on techniques for diffusing conflict, for resolving confrontation? I said, well, no, they learn that by being in a classroom. And, you know, that to me doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, what is one of the hardest things to do in the world for anybody? It's to be able to manage other people, and especially young people. And yet we're asking those who want to be teachers to figure it out on the job. I actually went to the Teacher Credentialing Commission and asked them to incorporate more in the curriculum on classroom management techniques, because I just don't think, frankly, I don't think it's fair to a poor young person who's going out to teach, and they're doing it for all the right reasons with, I think, a lot of idealism generally, and then to get chewed up by kids because they don't know how to manage that sort of circumstance.
Sure. And we want them to stay, right? We don't want to be in a situation in New Orleans where they have headsets on new teachers to teach them how to discipline the classroom in real time, right? I'm going to ask one more question, and then I want folks to be preparing questions for the panel, okay? The question is actually about the LCAPs. We saw a couple of years ago the LCFFs, and one of the things that people really haven't talked about, I'm going to write a piece about this for the Progressive magazine pretty soon, is that the stuff that you see in the reauthorization of ESEA, which is now ESSA, has the opportunity for dashboards. It has the opportunity for us to think about additional measures that we think are important assessment tools for schools. One of Dan Moslin sent me in a private communication. He says, we see signs of progress because in the national context there really are important steps being taken. In California, there are still inequities. In light of ESSA's passage, it's important to encourage other states to include school climate and discipline as new indicators, similar to what you see in the LCAP. What do you think about that? Is there and Dr. Romero and I went through 50 LCAPs of the 50 largest districts in the state. And as we were talking before, some of them look really traditional. Test scores, lots of test scores, test score goals. But then there were other LCAPs that were a little more innovative. What do you think about this potential for school discipline, not only in LCAPs, but also with the flexibility that ESSA is going to give states across the nation to design new accountability plans?
You want to talk about that?
I'll let you go. I'm Lisa.
Sorry. So Sue actually sat on a subcommittee with another trustee in our district. We just adopted the conceptual framework for a district data dashboard. We call it our district progress report. It has 16 metrics. It's not in our LCAP because we weren't ready to develop it or announce it in an LCAP that's due in June to our county board. We've been working on it on and off for a year and a half. And it's going to be built into board policy within the next year. And of that, there's three major areas. There's readiness and access, fairly simple. How do students achieve academically on an AP or IB exam? That's the readiness part. And the access piece is how many students are enrolled. Natomas now has about 50% of its seniors who've taken at least one AP or IB class over their 4-year period of time. The other piece is engagement. And engagement for us, we actually have graduation under engagement. We want to move beyond graduation in Natomas. Natomas does a very good job of graduating students. We actually took a look at our data 2 years ago, which is the freshest data we have from the state, and it shows that 80 to 90% of students who did not graduate in 4 years joined Natomas with either their junior or their senior year. And so far behind that, even creative efforts to help them graduate, we weren't able to get them to cross that line because they were too far behind. We also have a couple of things. California Healthy Kids Survey with elements that focus in on connectivity for students, and if students feel safe, that's an element that we give to multiple grade levels throughout a year, and that's included on our district progress report or dashboard. And as well, we have suspensions and expulsions. And we haven't set necessarily a target that we want to see those go down every year. I mean, as of December, we had 1 expulsion in our district. It's gone up a little bit in the last few months, to about 4 or 5 possible at this point. Last year, I think we had 15 total. So we're not going to come in every year and say that we can decrease expulsions every year or decrease suspensions. What we want to do, though, is make it present in the mind of our administrators, our staff, and allow the board to know that multiple times throughout the year, they're going to be able to look at these metrics and ask questions, and from that make policy and budget decisions included in the LCAP.
Well, I think the LCAPs are really important tools, and when we adopted LCFF in the legislature and the accompanying LCAP, one of the things that was discussed was how the LCAPs, for example, with respect to discipline, which is one of the elements, could become the vehicle for marking whether a district is in fact doing better or not, and it's part of this larger school climate issue. My own view is that LCAPs are only going to make a difference if not just the superintendent of the district takes it seriously, but the teachers have to, the community has to, the kids have to. I mean, an LCAP really only becomes a useful, productive tool if everybody, in my opinion, if everybody in the community is invested in it. And I think, at least in the first round of LCAPs, you saw some that were pretty Spartan. They didn't have a lot to them.
Yes.
And as you said, you saw some that were very, very traditional. And part of this is it's going to be interesting to see over time whether districts, and I think the districts have to do this, really push their constituencies to and that's a risk, by the way, to get engaged on the LCAPs, because that is what's going to be necessary in order for them to make a difference and to be meaningful.
I'll be honest with you, after reading 1,800 pages of LCAPs, when I would open that PDF and it was 500 pages, I would sigh. When I opened the LCAP and it was 12 pages, I felt a little better. But obviously, I think that the ones that make that investment and they work with the community, they work, for example, in Stockton, they work with NAACP on their LCAP, then it becomes a living document and it lives up to subsidiarity.
Right.
It lives up to the moniker of local accountability. Right. I would like to go to
So
the
Johnny,
audience.
can I say
Yes,
something
please.
on this? I think the LCAP is really important. So when we went out for public comment, you know, about what the public wanted in the district and what their opinions were, I think I have never been engaged in so many nights away and in so many schools and meeting so many parents, because the board made a point of attending every forum that was available in the community. Not only was the board there, every administrator from the district office was there, and along with translators. And so we actually witnessed and were engaged with these parents and watching, you know, and listening to them about what is it that you want, and you know, lots and lots of pages and time for parents to rotate and give input. And so when we finally came to the table for the LCAP, I, as someone who, you know, is elected by, like, you know, in the community, I'm accountable to, you know, to people, because number one, they're going to say, well, how many opportunities, you know, were there for people to give their input? And if we reached out in multiple ways to, for them to do this. But the thing is that even when the final document was compiled, we live in a community, and I think it just has something to do with Natomas. You probably could attest to this. I think, you know, a lot of elected officials live in Natomas. But we hear repeatedly from community members, this via email, via phone calls, in the grocery store, getting gas, whatever. You know, they're not shy about telling us what we do right and what we do wrong. Plus our regular board meetings. But I think that accountability, the board takes it. You know, we're very, very aware of it, and we're very dedicated to making sure that those things stay in place because we owe it to our kids. We said we're going to do it, and so we're going to do it. And if we don't do it, then you know we come back to the table again and say. And the superintendent is so wonderful. Says we did not meet this goal, and so we come back and we figure out how to meet it. So there is there's strong accountability.
Just as a point of information, the LCAPs are local accountability plans. You could think of them as like strategic plans, and they're focused on specific groups: foster kids, low SES kids, ELL kids, and they talk. They are supposed to talk to how the district is thinking strategically about specific goals, and then how they're strategically going to spend money to reach those goals. If you're really nerdy, you can email me, and I will send you PDFs of a few LCAPs. I might have some for districts in the local area if you'd like to see what an LCAP looks like. Okay, so I just go out to the audience. Yes, right here, Susan.
Yes, hi, I'm Susan Olson, and I am in the Doctorate program. So I have a background with charter schools, and particularly I was a principal of a new charter school, and I know I had a lot of say over, you know, what my teachers did in the classroom, and really had a really good communication about, you know, how we were going to do discipline. And I'm just wondering, in a school district, like what has it been like to get teachers on board and get them kind of going in the same direction? Has there been any resistance or sabotagers, or you know, what has it been like for the teachers for this shift and looking at things differently?
Yeah, our school district has about 1,100 employees. So like any large organization, change just doesn't happen overnight. The discussion about policy is great, but policy without action and monitoring just becomes some words on paper. So we've had some successes and we've had some challenges in implementing anything new that we've tried to do. And in particular in California right now, we're attempting to do everything at the same time. Trying to fund things new, trying to strategically plan new. We have new standards. We have new focus on discipline. So I'll be honest, there are times where we're not doing any of those things well, right? Because they say when you have too many things to focus on, you really don't have anything. Sometimes it feels like that. New textbooks in math, English just gets adopted, science and social studies are on their way, and they're needed. I mean, some of the social studies books we have are 1998, 1999, right? I mean, in a different century. And so it's definitely time since they've skipped the history of the 90s and the early 2000s altogether. But so there's been challenges and there's been successes. So we try to be intentional about it. We actually purchased a human resource system that tracks professional development as well as evaluations. We have a board policy that talks about accountability and support being reciprocal to each other. So it's one thing to have accountability. It's the other thing to make sure you support people to get there. And that's really important to us. And sometimes we do it well, and sometimes we say through our cycle of continuous learning improvement, realize we made a mistake and we need to step back and try to fix it.
I think the dynamics of teacher organizations was quite interesting and revealing when we were going through the legislative process. And there are two big teacher organizations, CFT and CTA. CFT almost instantly opposed the legislation having to do with discipline. CTA actually, throughout the course, never took a formal position, but they struggled mightily as an organization. What emerged was actually quite interesting, because they had an element that said, no, you don't touch us. So we're the masters of our universe. Nobody's taken away our ability to do what we want to do in our classroom. And others who agreed with the point of view I had. And you know what? It turned out to be largely generational. And I bet that doesn't surprise you. the older teachers, the ones who've been teaching longer, by and large, I don't want to make a mass indictment. They were the ones who said, you're not. I'm not changing. I'm running my classroom the way I want. And the younger teachers were the ones who, by and large, said, no, we need to keep kids in school. We need to figure out how to do that. It's very interesting.
Very interesting. Yes.
Hi, my name is Dr. Castaneda. I'm actually a recent graduate from the EdD program here. I listened to you, Assemblyman. I was thinking that those same epiphanies that you were talking about when you were looking at those numbers, that's what I struggled for many years. I've been a counselor working with at-risk students for a really long time. I decided at some point that what was important for them was also figuring out that educational piece. So over the last 8 years or so, my emphasis has been on working in the alignment of education and mental health. But not mental health from the eye of mental illness, but actually how do we treat the child as a whole person and not just as one piece, and looking really at the health, as in physical health, mental health of our students. And two things came up, and Dr. Heredia mentioned one of them, is as far as how do we train our teachers to know how to work with all that. And so we have a special education school, we are opening up a charter school, trying to do the training ourselves. But I was concerned about what you said about the Commission of Teaching Credentialing, as far as not having any particular course on conflict management, on how to deal with maybe some of that. I think you said 2010 when you had that inquiry.
Well, when I approached the commission on this issue was probably 2012.
So, do you know what was their response? I mean,
that's a good question. They were going to. They took up the issue, and then I left the legislature, and so I don't know whether they actually have taken any action to change the credentialing requirements or not. So someone in this room probably knows. But
standards are coming out right now, the new standards, and I'm not sure.
There's a lot of faculty in the audience and students that are very.
It's been in the special education credentialing for almost 20 years. So
what about regular ed?
Yeah, very little.
All right, well, I want to give the panelists maybe 1 minute for closing thoughts, something that they would like to mention as we wrap up.
It's hard for a professor to speak in 1 minute. This morning we had this amazing breakfast in Natomas where a student from every school, one student from every school was recognized for something that they've overcome. A challenge, whether they were abused or whether they were neglected or whether they were in special ed and got moved to the gifted class. That's what they. But the event this morning reminded me of my work, as a trustee. It keeps me going as a trustee. I hate those campaigns, those long hours, and everything. But there is so much work to do on the part of kids. And I came back after that this morning, inspired, but at the same time a little scared because without the collaboration of counselors, school psychologists, special ed, ELL, everybody coming together for the students, we just can't rely on one person anymore. And so it's that collaboration in the school sites and districts. And this morning, I just thought this is so critical, and we've come far, but we have so much farther to go. And I'm hopeful when I come, among like-minded people. So glad to be here.
Thank you.
A minute, huh? Wow. Well, I guess I'd say this. I remember when I first got into district office leadership. There was a school in the district I was working, and the school focused in particular on early elementary students who had been referred to the school in lieu of an expulsion for very serious crimes within the community. And I remember the first thing I said was, well, gosh, as we were teaching them behavior settings, what about their academics, right? Because I was a young administrator and had been taught about teaching reading and writing and history and science. And the principal at the time says, Mr. Evans, sometimes you have to enter into a child's life through a different lens. And so I think that there's a wonderful opportunity right now in education to continue rigorous academic access and readiness for students, but to also make sure that you put what's first for each individual child. And as Sue said, this morning we had our Every Student Succeeding breakfast, and it was 15 different stories of how our district had entered into different ways to access a child, whether it was through a psychologist who was in tears seeing one of his students be successful, whether it was a special education student who was exited from special education support in an RSP setting and moved into a GATE setting because of the work and commitment and the effort we had put into place. Meeting a child where they are, whether it be academic or behavioral, there's the opportunities here, and I think the timing's right. Thank you.
I would say in an overall perspective that you don't get an educated society on the cheap.
No.
It is the most important thing we do is educate our children, and to think that that's not worth the most that we can possibly invest in it is a big mistake. And I'm not talking about let's just give them a pile of money and let them go do whatever they want in the education world. It's certainly about using our resources wisely. But to piggyback just a little bit on Sue's point, if we think that teachers can be at their most effective if there are no counselors and there are no librarians and there are no nurses in the school and in the school district, we're making a big mistake. I mean, it takes that entire complement in order to deliver good educational experiences to children who want to then be in school. You all know kids who get up in the morning and want to go to school. They like being in school. They love being in school. And you know kids who are going to think about any way they can get out of school. There's a little bit of both those things, I think, in most kids. But we want to be in a position where school is something that kids want to do. That's where they want to be. And I think you do that, to bring it back to the issue that brought us here tonight. You accomplish that by creating a positive, caring school environment, school climate. And then that's where kids want to be and they want to learn.
Fantastic. I just want to thank the panelists so much for coming. I also want to thank our partners across campus, the PPA program. And I also want to thank the crack staff of the EdD, Christy, Garrett, and Elizabeth, and Christian for helping make this happen, and the food and everything. And I also want to thank you for skipping happy hour to be here with us. Thank you.